Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome, colleagues and friends, to today's session. I'm Meg Swacha, the Scholarly Communications Officer at the United Nations Dag Hammarskjöld Library, as well as your moderator. Today, we are honored to present the annual keynote session of the Dag Hammarskjöld Library's Insight Series, which is scheduled in recognition of International Open Access Week. An opportunity to continue our learning about the benefits of open access, to share what we've learned with colleagues, and to inspire wider participation across the global research communities. Open access, open scholarship, open science play a pivotal role in advancing the mission of the UN by democratizing knowledge, promoting inclusivity, and driving global progress to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. As we continue to work towards a more equitable and just world, the expansion and support of open access are vital to ensuring that knowledge flows freely and that benefits of scientific and intellectual advancements reach all people, leaving no one behind. Today's event will also include a brief presentation of the third Annual Accelerator Award for libraries. But first, a few housekeeping items. Please note this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the Dag Hammarskjöld Library's website as well as its YouTube channel. It is also governed by the UN Code of Conduct. By joining this event, you are agreeing to abide by this code. Today's session will be offered in English, and we apologize that the platform does not provide for automatic translation. We invite you to turn on captions. We have reserved time for a discussion following the keynote presentation, so please add your questions into the chat as they come up. My colleagues are watching that space, and we will collect your questions for the end. And with that, I will hand things over to the head of the Dag Hammarskjöld Library and Information Management Section, Thanos Giannakopoulos.
Thank you very much, Megs. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to everyone. Thank you for joining us on this event. And also thank you to my colleagues, Meg Swacha, Ariel Lebovitz, and Janine Picard, and everyone who got involved in organizing this wonderful event. Open access and open science have been at the core of the works functions of the UN Dag Hammarskjöld Library since 2018. We are proud to have brought the discussion and the global dialogue on open science and open access into the United Nations headquarters and invite experts as well as UN diplomats and UN staff on these very important discussions, not only for the mission of the organization, but also for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In 2023, the Global Sustainable Development Goals report, which is the leading report on the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, clearly recognized that access to scientific results and the acceleration of science and scientific progress is one of the key criteria for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, the mission of the organization. Apparently, however, we see that while misinformation and disinformation flows freely online, scientific information, credible scientific information, is increasingly being locked behind paywalls. I think the open access movement and the open science recommendation that was put forward by UNESCO are a wonderful costs that we will always need to keep in mind. And today, especially for us that come from the library and information management work, but also for publishers, scientists, diplomats, policymakers, and so on. So today we have invited one of the key figures and someone that has been active in the open access to knowledge for over 20 years to give us a little bit of an overview on where open access started, how it progressed, and where it is today. But before we go into that wonderful keynote that we're all expecting, I would like to invite you all, please, to celebrate with us one of the key moments in our annual cycle on work functions, and that is the United Nations Accelerator Award for libraries. So this is an award that was established by the Steering Committee for UN Secretariat Libraries, which I co-chair, and that committee oversees some of the functions and the work of the UN libraries across the globe. So we devised in that committee this award that is to be offered to the UN staff, the UN librarian or information manager, who has actually accelerated access to information by opening access to this type of information, or has diversified the way our services have been delivered. And I am truly honored that this year the award has been decided that it will be offered to the UN Hammarskjöld Library, and in particular to one of our most cherished colleagues, my colleague Nasra Sood. This is offered within the criteria of the award because Nasra, in her work for over 20 years with the UN Hammarskjöld Library, has significantly worked through the United Nations Consortium for Acquisition of Information Resources and has secured the best deals for information resources and databases, not only for the UN Hammarskjöld Library, not only for the UN Secretariat libraries, but also for libraries across the UN Secretariat, the UN system of organizations. And this is quite a large system of organizations. I think NASA is one of the colleagues that has worked diligently and constantly reminds me this maxim about administration. The maxim goes that when administration is visible, it has failed its mission. And the work that NASA has been doing for over 20 years has never been visible. However, the results of the work are what allows and has allowed delegates, diplomats, UN staff, as well as researchers from the world, from all over the world, to access information. So in this regard, I would like to present my colleague Nasra with this award that comes directly from the committee. And I look forward to offering this to you in person on October 29 in our own town hall of our section. And for that, I want to thank you very much for everything that you have done and you continue to do. And we are grateful, we are thankful, and over to you, Nasra.
Wow. Thank you so much, Thanos, for your kind words. And this is totally unexpected. Honestly, what an honor to receive such a prestigious award. Never in my wildest dreams did I think that I would be an honoree of this award. But thank you very much for recognizing me and for and awarding me this honor. Thank you. You know, it comes actually at a very special moment because, as you know, and most of my I'm getting a lot of messages to congratulate me. So thank you to everyone who sent messages. Yeah, so I'm retiring from the UN next year after 27 years of my UN career. So this comes at a very special moment. So I am grateful that it demonstrates it demonstrates the service that I have the service to the UN. So it's very sweet. So thank you very much for giving me this award to part with when I leave next year. And I have to share this award with my colleagues, past and present, who I have admired and who have inspired me through their hard work and professionalism. And one of them, of course, is Yelene, who I work with every day. She's become a friend and a colleague, and I really mimic her professionalism, her hard work, and her tenacity in getting the work done no matter what. And as you know, we've had ups and downs, with shortage of staff, but we've held on, and it's because of her inspiration that has actually helped move us along. And so I have this award I share directly with Yelene. And past colleagues, Amy and Joelle, I have honestly admired their work ethic, their professionalism, and I have always mimicked them. And I feel like I have come this far because of all the help, the support, and the respect that I have been given by them, by my colleagues. And then, of course, there's Dalal, who's just joined us. It's only been over a year, but I also appreciate Dalal for your support and for your guidance, for your uncompromising support, I should say, and your guidance. And then I shouldn't forget Ali. Ali, I thank you for being who you are. And he's been a friend and support system. So yes, so I have to. I'm sharing this award with all my colleagues, and I truly appreciate them all. And then lastly, if I have anything to say to inspire others, it's that, as cliche as this sounds, but love what you do and be creative in making your work interesting. Honestly, I think that gets you through the day, and others notice that your work gets noticed, and it just makes the work more interesting. So that's my parting words, if I can share an inspiration.
Thank you.
Okay, and thank you once again.
Thank you so much, Nazra, for all of the work that you do, and congratulations on receiving this award.
Thank you.
And so with that, it is my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Melissa Hagemann. Melissa has been a leader of the Access to Knowledge movement for over 20 years. She managed the Open Society Institute's, now the Open Society Foundation's, work to define open access through the Budapest Open Access Initiative, and went on to support the development of the global open access movement. To mark the 20th anniversary of the BOAI, the Budapest Open Access Initiative, she spearheaded the development of new recommendations, which emphasize that open access is not an end in itself, but a means to further ends, above all, to the equity, quality, sustainability, and usability of research. Melissa co-organized the meeting that led to the Cape Town Open Education Declaration, which offered strategies for the development of the global open education movement. She facilitated the creation of open education coalitions in Brazil, the Czech Republic, Macedonia, Mongolia, Poland, and Slovakia. In addition, she supported the development of progressive copyright reform at the national and international levels. Early in her career, Melissa directed the Open Society Institute's library program, based out of the Foundation's office in Budapest, which supported collection development, library automation, and management training in 24 countries in Central and Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union, and Haiti. She has served on numerous boards, including the advisory board of the Wikimedia Foundation, as well as the Open Climate Campaign. And so with that, I welcome you, Melissa, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Megs, and I'm really honored to have been asked to keynote this event. So thank you again for the invitation to join you for this event for Open Access Week. To begin, I would say that we have accomplished more than many could have hoped for when the open access movement was defined. Yet we are at a juncture where I believe it is helpful to return to our roots and remember why the open access movement was launched. To do that, I'll provide background on the development of the BOAI, my perspective on the growth of the global open access movement, discuss where I believe the movement stands today, and outline strategies for the further development of equitable open access. Now, as background on the development of BOAI, way back in the late 1990s, as was mentioned, I worked for the Open Society Institute's office in our office in Budapest, and the foundation supported publishing, library, and journals programs. And at this point, I was managing our journals program, which distributed hard copies of scientific journals to academies of sciences in Central and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. Now, at a budget meeting with George Soros, our founder and funder, he challenged us to develop a new model to distribute the same journal content in our region without shipping the journals. This led to months of research, during which time I discovered several exciting new projects, including the Open Archives Initiative, which had recently held their first meeting and which provided a framework to support the self-archiving community, as well as two new publishers, BioLine International and Biomed Central, which were making their journals freely available online. I was also inspired by 3 leading academics who had recently called on publishers to relinquish the rights to publish articles after 6 months. Of course, these were the founders of PLOS, Pat Brown, Mike Eisen, and Harold Varmus. And probably most fortuitously, a philosophy professor at Earlham College contacted me inquiring about support for his new project, the free online scholarship newsletter. Connecting with this professor, Peter Suber, who has gone on to become the father of the open access movement, was key to all of our work going forward. Peter, together with Fred Friend of University College London, Leslie Chan, the co-founder of BioLine International, and Jean-Claude Guidon of the University of Montreal, would become our mentors and sounding board as we navigated the development of this new field. Working with the chair of our board, Istvan Rev, and the director of our program, Darius Kuplinskis, we decided to organize a meeting in Budapest to bring together these leaders who were exploring alternative publishing models. Darius wrote a framing document for the convening entitled Towards a Global Knowledge Commons, which described the meeting as a workshop on enabling open and affordable scholarly communications through alternative publication and distribution models. We met over the first weekend in December of 2001 in our office in Budapest. We had 2 days of rich discussions, and at one point, Istvan Rev, the chair of our board, suggested that instead of a one-way route, we try to create a 2-way communication and make not only the Western academic or policy results available to the communities in, as he put it, the less fortunate parts of the world, but also share the most important local knowledge to the broader scientific community as well. We tried to give a name to our ambition, and after floating a few ideas, including open archives, we settled on open access. This is just a shot of the flip chart from our meeting, which I thought it might be fun to have a look at. Istvan turned to Peter Suber and asked Peter to take the lead in drafting a manifesto to share our ideas with the world. Thankfully, for all those who have benefited from open access, Peter agreed. This led to a 2-month collaborative drafting process, which resulted in the Budapest Open Access Initiative, which offered the first definition of open access. The BOAI opens by stating an old tradition and a new technology have converged to make possible an unprecedented public good. To achieve open access, the BOAI recommends 2 complementary strategies, that of self-archiving or depositing articles into repositories, as well as open access journals. Now, concurrent to the drafting process, we tried to raise support for this new idea, both internally within OSI and externally, and George Soros pledged $3 million. We released the BOAI on February 14th, 2002, and it is fair to say that the initiative was not warmly welcomed by all. One Publishers Association issued a statement citing that the BOAI can only serve to undermine the formal publishing process which these communities value, and we find it alarming that a responsible organization, OSI, proposes to subsidize such an initiative. However, others, such as Nature, pointed to the domino effect the BOAI and OSI support could have in convincing other funders and research institutions to become involved. Writing in The Scientist, one commentator remarked, the BOAI may not have the same historic import as the theses of Martin Luther or the U.S. Declaration of Independence, but it has the potential to shake up the world of scientific publishing in a profound way. To introduce open access and build support for it, OSI funded outreach to the communities within the scholarly publishing system, in particular libraries, publishers, and researchers. A key partner for all of our work on open access has been SPARC. Rick Johnson, their first director, participated in the BOAI meeting, and his successor, Heather Joseph, has become one of the global leaders of the movement and the mastermind behind significant policy gains. One of our first collaborations with Spark was to support the development of practical guides for the movement, including open access journals, business guides, and guides to institutional repository software systems developed by Ram Crow. Given the lukewarm reception that the BOAI received from many publishers, we were pleased when ALPS, or the Association of Learned and Professional Society Publishers, agreed to co-sponsor a roundtable with OSI and their members in September of 2002 to, as they put it, consider the future of journal publishing and specifically the opportunities and threats that open access brings to researchers, librarians, and publishers. Following the meeting, ALPS agreed to additional roundtables with OSI, and they stated that open access could be the only survival strategy for society journals. We ended up sponsoring 3 roundtables with ALPS and their members, and by the end of the third, one of their prominent members, who had been extremely critical of open access during the first meeting, shared how he planned to experiment with it for his own journals. This example highlights that while many groups were initially critical, once we were able to engage them and show how open access could benefit their communities, there was generally room for discussion, engagement, and experimentation. In addition to publishers, we reached out to engage researchers and librarians through the organization of conferences and convenings. To introduce open access to researchers, we organized a meeting of the Academy of the Sciences from Central and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union and China in 2003 in Budapest. Pivotal to the acceptance and support of open access was the embrace of it by leading funders, notably Howard Hughes Medical Institute, the Max Planck Society, and the Wellcome Trust. In early 2003, HHMI organized a meeting in Bethesda, Maryland in the US, which introduced and produced the Bethesda Statement, which offered a definition of open access publication and critically suggested concrete steps that all relevant parties can take to promote the rapid and efficient transition to open access publishing. To my knowledge, the Bethesda Statement was the first to highlight the critical role that the reform of the research assessment process would play within the broader adoption of open access. The Max Planck Society organized the third meeting, which would go on to shape the open access movement. Held in Berlin in October of 2003, the meeting produced the Berlin Declaration, which became a key framing document focused on institutions that organizations could sign to share their commitment to open access. Now, it's a nice coincidence, the meetings which laid the foundation for the open access movement were organized in cities beginning with a B, and Peter Suber has referred to the 3 events combined as the BBB definition of open access, as the 3 overlap and inform one another. And probably most importantly, the Wellcome Trust became the first research funder to introduce a mandatory open access policy in 2005. Under the leadership of Mark Walpert, Wellcome had released a statement of strong support for open access in 2003, citing open and unrestricted access to the published output of research was a fundamental part of its charitable mission. It is extraordinary to think that Wellcome took this bold step in 2005. Interest in this new field by funders was crucial, for we knew that the funders were key to the successful development of open access, and that is as true today as it was in 2002. To directly support the development of open access in developing and transition countries, OSI helped launch the EIFL Open Access Program. EIFL, or the Electronic Information for Libraries Network, initially focused on building library consortia in Central and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, and then expanded to Africa and Asia. In 2003, the Eiffel Open Access Program was launched, and we organized our first workshop to introduce the open access model in South Africa. We were pleased with the warm reception that open access received in South Africa and went on to organize similar workshops to introduce the model in Ukraine, Lithuania, and China. We were incredibly fortunate to have our colleague from the Open Society Institute Foundation in Ukraine, Irina Kuchma, organize the workshop in Kiev. She has gone on to lead the Eiffel Open Access Program and is a true champion of the equitable development of open access globally. From 2004 to 2006, much of our funding was focused in supporting the development of OA in the fast-growing economies of Brazil, India, China, and South Africa. During these early years, there were several critical moments where I believe the open access movement could have splintered. And these include rising tensions between the self-archiving and open access journals communities. We first saw this play out in the drafting of the BOAI, but as the movement began to grow, there were rising conflicts between those advocating these two complementary strategies to such a degree that it threatened the overall objectives of the movement. Thanks to the sage leadership of Peter Suber and others, sanity prevailed, and we were able to keep the two camps united towards our overall goal. The second was the Developing Nations License. Now, OSI's intellectual property program was asked to support the overhaul of Creative Commons Developing Nations License, which would make works freely available in developing countries. However, we questioned why support the DNL instead of going straight for open access. Our main concern was one of dividing the open access movement between North and South, as our overall goal was building a global knowledge commons. Thankfully, Creative Commons agreed, and Larry Lessig retired the DNL, citing that the license is in conflict with the growing open access publishing movement. As he wrote, while the license frees creative work in the developing nations, it does not free work in any way elsewhere. This means these licenses do not meet the minimum standards of the open access movement. And the third was the proposed development of a global open access organization. Now, while there had been talk of it before, in 2006 at the Berlin meeting in Potsdam, some leaders of the movement were strongly advocating for the establishment of a global open access organization. As several of us, including Leslie Chan, Alma Swan, John Wilbanks, and I, sat jet-lagged in front of a roaring fire over a late dinner, the question came, wasn't it time for an overarching global organization to be formed, which would provide direction and management for the movement? While there were advantages to such an approach, we forcefully pushed back because we felt that open access would only succeed if it continued to be a grassroots movement that did not rely upon direction from above. Thankfully, this argument won out, as open access is a global movement and no one organization can dictate what advocates on the ground in different countries and contexts should be doing. To unlock government-funded research, we collaborated with Spark and Public Knowledge to develop the strategy of advocating for public access to publicly funded research. Spark developed the Open Access Working Group and the Alliance for Taxpayer Access and set their sights on making all research published by the U.S. National Institutes of Health publicly available. One of the first signs that our growing open access movement was gaining traction came as our small group of librarians, patient rights advocates, and OA publishers came under attack by commercial journal publishers. As we were seeing the strategy of advocating for open access to taxpayer-funded research gain traction with policymakers, the academic publishers launched a fierce lobbying campaign to attack our small open access movement. While it is surprising, the academic publishing industry is one of the most profitable businesses in the world, with profit margins hovering around 40%. In an attempt to preserve their financial position, the Association of American Publishers hired Eric Desenhall, who had been described as the pit bull of public relations and had worked for Exxon to attack environmental groups. Now he was advising the publishers on how to attack open access advocates. Nature revealed that Desenhall advised the publishers to focus their attacks on simple messages such as public access equals government censorship, and equating public access to federally funded research and open access with the destruction of the peer review system. This last line of attack became one of the most widely used by the publishing industry. Thankfully, the public access argument won the support of policymakers, and the open access movement secured its first major policy win with the adoption of the NIH mandate in 2008. The new policy made NIH-funded research publicly available after 12 months. As Peter Suber described the new policy, measured by the ferocity of opposition overcome and the volume of literature liberated, this is the largest victory so far for the open access movement. Now, the second decade of open access saw significant policy gains in Europe. Spark Europe, with Alma Swan at the helm, spearheaded advocacy efforts that resulted in the development of an open access policy in the European Union's Horizon 2020 program, which ran from 2014 to 2020 and provided 80 billion euros in research funding. The open access policy required that articles be deposited in a repository with a 6-month embargo for STEM subjects and 12 months for social sciences and humanities. In the US, expanding on the NIH mandate, the Obama administration issued an executive directive directing all federal funding agencies with research and development budgets of over $100 million to develop public access policies to make all research publicly available within 12 months of publication. The directive, together with Horizon 2020, represented milestones we could not have envisioned a decade earlier. It was, as Cambridge OA advocate Peter Murray Rust aptly quoted from Churchill, "This is not the end. This is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning." Since the launch of the BOAI, as I mentioned, we supported outreach to the communities within the scholarly publishing system, including librarians, researchers, and publishers. However, for the first decade of the movement, we neglected to include one critical community in our work, that of students and early career researchers. Somehow we had omitted this vital group from our work. And the reality is that while OA benefits so many communities, care must be taken in its implementation, for there is a potential for OA to have a negative impact on early career researchers due to the financial barriers of exorbitant article processing charges, or APCs, as well as the fact that some open access journals still are not recognized by promotion and tenure committees. We were thrilled to support SPARC to launch the Right to Research Coalition, which became an international alliance with more than 90 undergraduate and graduate student organizations in over 100 countries around the world. The coalition worked to promote openness in research through advocacy and education. It was founded by Nick Shockey, whose passion for open access is infectious. Nick traveled the world speaking with students and early career researchers. And from their work with the coalition, SPARC developed OpenCon, which became a platform for catalyzing change by connecting a global community of next generation leaders who were driving the culture shift toward open locally, nationally, and internationally. I believe this work led to an inflection point with a new generation of advocates adding their voices, perspectives, and passion to the movement. Over the past 20 years, since the launch of the BOAI, we have seen the development of a global movement which has moved open access from an untested concept into the mainstream. And today, just over half of all scholarly journal articles are now available for anyone to freely access and to read. While we celebrate this remarkable progress, we also recognize that to fully realize the promise of open access that was envisioned when the BOAI was launched, we have more work to do to ensure that the systems we are building are truly equitable. It is critical for the community to work together to guard against adopting policies, practices, and business models that make scholarly communication free to read, but in the process create new barriers for authors to publish. It is against this backdrop that the BOAI launched a global community consultation, which resulted in new recommendations being launched 2 years ago. The BOAI 20 recommendations remind us that open access is not an end in itself, but a means to further ends. Above all, it is a means to the equity, quality, usability, and sustainability of research. Our 4 high-level recommendations call for supporting community-controlled infrastructure, which aligns perfectly with the theme of Open Access Week of community over commercialization, as well as reforming of research assessment and rewards. We also call for favoring inclusive publishing and distribution channels that move away from article processing charges and never exclude authors on economic grounds, as well as favor publishing models that benefit all regions of the world, are controlled by academic-led and nonprofit organizations, and importantly, move away from transformative or read and publish agreements. It has been exciting and encouraging to see the beginning of a renewed focus on equity, both at the policy and community levels over the past few years. Major new progressive policies centered on equity have been issued. These include, as Thanos had mentioned at the beginning, the UNESCO recommendation on open science, which was released in 2021, which is comprehensive in scope, highlights the importance of non-commercial community research infrastructure, and has been approved by 193 countries. In the US, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy issued a sweeping memorandum in August of 2022 entitled Ensuring Free, Immediate, and Equitable Access to Federally Funded Research. The new policy will make all US taxpayer-funded research immediately available to the public. Setting a critical precedent for national policy, the OSTP memo treats open access as a means to achieve equity. Last year, the EU Council issued conclusions on open scholarly communication that call for transparent, equitable, and open access to scholarly publications through the immediate and unrestricted access to publicly funded research. Earlier this year, the Gates Foundation announced a refresh of their open access policy through which they will mandate preprints for all grantees, encourage preprint peer review, and importantly, remove funding for article processing charges. And just last week, the Dutch Research Council launched a new Diamond Open Access Fund to support journals that wish to transition from a subscription-based model to an open access model in which authors do not pay publication fees or the article processing charges. As the announcement highlights, with the Diamond Open Access Fund, the Council aims to contribute to the development of a fair, more equitable, and diverse ecosystem for open access publishing. Building on these policies, the global community is increasingly pursuing paths to open access focused on greater equity, including the pioneering work being done in Latin America to support open access infrastructure led by Redalic, Cielo, and Amelica. Critical work to reform research assessment is being pursued by DORA, CORA, the U.S. National Academy's Roundtable on Aligning Incentives for Open Scholarship, and Helios. The landscape for OA publishing is shifting with mass resignations by editorial boards over excessively high article processing charges and a growing interest in Diamond and Subscribe to Open as values-aligned business models. In addition, we see the strengthening of a global repository infrastructure spearheaded by CORE, while universities are developing rights retention policies. And last year, Bulgaria adopted the world's first zero embargo publishing right. And this year, the country adopted a national secondary publishing obligation. This renewed energy, and not just making content open access, but on how the content is made openly available, is laying the foundation to realize the promise of open access put forth by the BOAI of uniting humanity in a common intellectual conversation and quest for knowledge. To support the achievement of this vision, the BOAI is transitioning to playing a more active role within the access to knowledge movement by creating a new organization, which will foster the development of equitable open access and support the adoption of policies, practices, and sustainability models that make scholarly communication free to read and publish. We've been working with our steering committee on the development of our strategic plan, and we'll be launching early next year. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your intervention, and again for being with us here today, Melissa. It was absolutely thrilling to learn more about the early efforts that served as the foundation for the open access movement, especially in regions of the world that have been historically dominated by large commercial publishers. If I can say, I've worked in open access and the free culture movement for some 15 years, and I learned a lot of new things today and put different pieces of the puzzle together. And so your intervention really shows how relatively few people can have a huge impact and when launching something, when working together. So moving to today, the UNESCO recommendations on open access, on open science, have identified equity as a core value. And we saw some examples of equity in open infrastructures, open communities. What advice would you provide to smaller groups of people or publishers committed to equity, but perhaps without the resources to remove all possible barriers to actors?
Well, I believe that it's helpful to work with community-governed organizations and initiatives, infrastructure. And much of these key pieces of infrastructure have originated in the Global South, where many projects haven't had the funding to buy commercial alternatives. So they've developed them themselves, and they are place equity at the center of their work. And some of examples of this are Riedalik and Cielo and Amilica, as I mentioned. And I think more and more we need to be looking to take lessons from the Global South. Unfortunately, I think the trend within the scholarly communications community is taking lessons from the Global North and pushing them to the Global South, and having our partners in that region having to react to new developments from the Global North, which put much of the work being done in the Global South at jeopardy, such as article processing charges, which we've been trying to, which the commercial publishers have been trying to transfer to that region of the world. So I think if we begin to take more lessons from the Global South and share them, so to flip the model which we have now and to share those lessons more broadly, that can definitely help to address these issues. And that's one area that the BOAI org will be working on.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. It's something that we certainly have heard as a through line at the biennial UN Open Science Conference. Just to kind of build upon that, one of the key parts of that, one of the other through lines of that conference has been the intellectual exchanges between the Global South and the Global North. So I once read Leslie Chan writing that the aspirations of the early open access movement was to make visible the knowledge produced out of the Global South. So not just providing access to the publishing systems in the Global North, but to accessing the research produced by, out of entities like Riedalik and Cielo. What do you see as some of the barriers to discovering and accessing that knowledge produced in the Global South?
Right. I think it's exactly as you point out. We need to be able to capture the work being done in the Global South in the global indexes. And I know that the DOAJ has, the Directory of Open Access Journals has been working at this through their ambassadors program. At the same time, as you mentioned, organizations like Read-Alik and Cielo have their own indexes of journals published in their regions. So I think to foster greater collaborations between the indexes and directories that are being used in the Global South, and sharing that information globally will help to surface that knowledge which is being produced in the Global South, which, as you mentioned, as Leslie had pointed out, was one of our goals with the BOAI.
Yeah, thank you. Moving to a question from the chat, Amy Nurnberger has asked, what are the experiences you would recommend other open movements, so open data, open software, open protocols, open hardware, et cetera, take away from the open access efforts to motivate and build towards similar successes?
Well, I think with open access, it was very helpful to have the BOAI just as a declaration to lay out our aspirations. And then, as I mentioned, we wanted it always to be a grassroots movement. So this is what we want to work towards, and then help those communities work towards it, not top down, but providing the support to the communities to work towards the ultimate goal. And when there are frictions between different players within the movement, to try to have wise leaders like Peter Suber and others to be able to talk and to be able to work through these differences, because splintering of movements is so harmful, and because it takes away the energy that you need to focus on your overall goals. So to lay out your aspirations and then to support communities to work towards your overall goals.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. It really did strike me during your intervention that at this moment where there was kind of a significant culture change, right, that some might receive as threatening, the ways in which the movement created room for, as you said, discussion, engagement, and experimentation, keeping folks at the table and in the room, which can be I know, such a significant challenge. So let's see, we have another question, and I do want to point out some folks are mentioning wonderful resources in the chat, and I just want to surface those. The Latin America Network for Open Science, La Referencia, Latindex, etc. So there is a question, what do you think about the roles that promotion, academic promotion play within this larger landscape?
Right. Well, as I mentioned, the Bethesda Declaration from HHMI's meeting was the first, so back in 2003, to really highlight the important role that research assessment plays with a broader adoption of open access. And so there are many communities focused on that work right now because it's critical. In some instances, promotion and tenure committees are not recognizing articles published in open access publications. And so this, as I mentioned, is a barrier to many to publish in open access. And this affects, unfortunately, earlier career researchers, among others. And that's why it's so important that so much energy is being focused on that now, because we need to be inclusive and to be able to not only offer open access for tenured professors to be able to have the freedom to publish in open access, but to have those who are earlier in their careers and wanting to share their articles globally to be able to publish in open access as well.
Yeah, I know when I was a a frontline ScholComm librarian more directly serving researchers, one of the primary questions I received was from early career researchers, graduate students, assistant professors who wanted to make their work available open access, but were unable to pay those fees that some journals and publishers require to do so.
Exactly. And that's why I think it's so important right now, just to add that there seems to be this trend of moving away from the APCs, and with the Gates Foundation's leadership in this area, hopefully other foundations will follow as well.
Yeah. Thank you. We have a question from Monica Granados of the Open Climate Campaign. In a way, the Global North is behind in having the necessary frameworks to transition to equitable models like the non-APC publishing. Have you thought about how we build a transition plan from our current model to something more like Redalyc in Latin America?
Well, by spreading the good work that Redalyc is doing and helping to supporting other regions to adopt such work, I think would be critical. And again, it's taking the lessons from the Global South and sharing them globally. Because I know that Ariana Becerril Garcia from Redalyc joined your conference in February of last year, I think. And it's so great to begin to highlight that type of work and to be able to share it with different regions. And hopefully they can begin to take lessons from these projects.
Thank you. And we have a question from Abdullah Shams bin Tariq that points to some of the challenges around that author pays model of OpenA. Clearly, this is something that is very much at the front of mind for many researchers and members of the publishing community and the research community, noting the opportunities for increased profit, the greater financial pressures that are put upon authors and institutions. And so our attendee asks, in hindsight, the choice of author pays as a mainstream mode of implementation, do we think it was a mistake? I think UNESCO has referred to this as an unintended consequence. And sort of looking to other models like Subscribe to Open, in coordination with self-archiving, green open access, and diamond OA models. So how might we position these beside each other?
Right. Well, in hindsight, it is interesting to look back because David Prosser, who was the director of Spark Europe back, I think he started in 2003, wrote a paper on how the hybrid model for open access could actually be implemented. And today, hybrid isn't looked upon favorably, but in 2003, the proposal was that hybrid would be a model that publishers could use to transition their journals to open access. So the original model was that the publishers would offer their authors the option of electing to pay an article processing fee. And then once a certain percentage of authors from that journal elected to pay the article processing fee, the whole journal would flip to open access. And I think today the hybrid model is used by publishers to, as they say, double dip, to both get the article processing charges and the subscriptions to support their work. So originally, the article processing charge was just going to be a way to transition to open access, to full open access. And the publishers found a way to hugely profit from it. So this is where we are. And I very much support the alternatives which have been developed. Subscribe to Open is hugely exciting. The Diamond model, so much energy is going into that. And the Diamond Conference in South Africa in December should be a great venue to continue those discussions as to how to further support the diamond model itself.
Yeah, and I really appreciate your point around double, perhaps depending on one's perspective, triple dipping. I do note that when working with a hybrid journal, that there are sometimes still opportunities to pair that with self-archiving if the author does not have the ability to pay an APC. Okay, to return to, we have so many great questions coming into the chat. We have a great question. Do you think the open access movement should be more actively supporting the open communication of research outputs other than articles, especially earlier in the research life cycle?
So I think this is, I think that's within the broader frame of open research. And I'm of two minds because as I mentioned, when we defined open access, we were playing with a couple of different terms for it, and open archives was one. We settled with open access, but I think open research could have been one as well. But today we have the framing of open research, which captures outputs from the whole research cycle. And open access is just one of those, just specifically targeting the article itself. But when you look at, I think open research and open science are very similar in that way. And so open access advocates do work with the broader open research community to facilitate the sharing of knowledge as it is produced in the research cycle. But the open access is specifically referring to the research articles themselves.
Thank you. If you will forgive me for bringing in some buzzwords, I would be remiss if I did not mention artificial intelligence. So at the United Nations, we recently held in September the UN Summit for the Future, and artificial intelligence, particularly generative AI, is really at front of mind. What do you see as the challenges and opportunities for open access, open science, and artificial intelligence? And perhaps more importantly, what would you hope to see?
Well, one of my main concerns with AI is that I believe it targets what's at the center and doesn't capture what's at the margins. And especially when we're working with open access and we want to include the global community, that is really top of mind. And I think that there have been many discussions around the use of copyright to address issues around AI. And I don't really think that copyright is the right tool. Instead, really looking at possible regulatory interventions, as well as the adoption of effective governance for AI projects. It can be attractive to researchers in terms of possibly providing new tools, such as tools that help with locating relevant resources, translation, editing, possibly peer review. But I think that there are also, this does raise ethical concerns around how to properly cite the use of these tools, and if these tools are permitted by a given institution. I think that there is much experimentation that's being done, but at the same time, authors who already are somewhat concerned about the role of academic publishers don't necessarily feel comfortable about such agreements, as Taylor and Francis did earlier this year with their AI agreement with Microsoft, selling their journals content for $10 million. So I think that there are many potential benefits, but at the same time, concerns which the scholarly communications community needs to be at the table and participating in those discussions to ensure that it doesn't destabilize much of the work which we have been doing.
Yeah, very much so. And I know it's really having implications for the operations of different journals in terms of review processes, which journal to submit to. And we're also seeing it starting to, with the large commercial publishers of the global north, find its way into contracts with libraries and other information providers, as well as with the authors themselves. So your point about those larger agreements is very well taken. I'm just going through our many questions. There are great points around the United Nations and Science Europe within the evaluation of science. As you know, the UN Hammarskjöld Library is currently preparing for its next Open Science Conference in the fall of 2025. We will, of course, announce those dates and the location when available. What recommendations would you have for the United Nations and other international organizations to advance the implementation of information as a global public good?
Well, I know that these organizations do produce research themselves, and so doing as best they can to make all research produced and supported by the organizations openly available through the use of an open license is the first step, but not always an easy one. I know that from my work within the Open Society Foundations. In addition, just to be advocating for equitable open access, because I think, as I mentioned, for so long, it's just been open access writ large, but we've seen the need to really change the framing to equitable open access to make sure that we can not only read the research, but anyone can also publish it. And we break down those barriers which have been created, which are excluding many authors, not just from the global south, but from under-resourced institutions globally, early career researchers as well.
Wonderful. And I think that's a great note to end on for today. Melissa, thank you so much again for serving as our keynote speaker. And thank you as well for everyone who has attended. We will be sure to make this recording available, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of your days.